The village in question was nestled in the heart of Transylvania, a region steeped in history, myth, and mystery. Its remote location, surrounded by misty forests and jagged mountain peaks, had long isolated it from the bustling world outside. The name of the village has been obscured by time, but its eerie reputation still lingers in historical records. A place where death, it seems, had a much darker meaning than one could ever expect. For over a century, this village maintained a chilling and perplexing anomaly. No one died of natural causes. At first glance, it seems like a bizarre statistical curiosity, but the more we dig into the details, the more it begins to unravel as something far more unsettling. What could possibly explain such a thing? Was it merely coincidence, or did something far more sinister lie at the heart of this dark mystery? As we dig deeper into the events of the 18th century, we begin to see patterns that suggest the village's fate may have been shaped by forces far beyond the normal scope of nature. Transylvania itself was no stranger to strange occurrences. The region was, and still is, synonymous with bloodthirsty legends, most famously, the vampire lore that emanates from the myth of Count Dracula. But beyond the well-known tales of the undead, Transylvania has long been a place where the boundaries between myth and reality seem to blur, where eerie happenings and unexplained deaths have been part of the social fabric for centuries. The 18th century was no different. But what made this village unique was the sheer scale and consistency of the deaths that defied all natural explanation. While the village remained small and seemingly peaceful, records from the time show a startling consistency. Every death in the village, without exception, was attributed to unnatural causes. This wasn't a single year or isolated incident. It spanned generations, leading some historians to speculate that the village was cursed, that some malevolent force had settled upon it, and that its grip over the community could never be broken. What makes this situation even more chilling is the fact that no one seemed to ask why. It was as if the villagers had become numb to the bizarre nature of their own deaths. Those who lived nearby, those who heard whispers of the strange demographic pattern emerging from a village, were quick to distance themselves from it, viewing it with a mixture of fear and suspicion. The isolation of the village allowed it to fester in its peculiar state, and yet, no one seemed to want to investigate too deeply. Of course, at the time, there were no modern forensic techniques to shed light on the mystery. No autopsies or toxicology reports would confirm suspicions of foul play, and the villagers themselves might have been too steeped in their superstitions to look at things from a medical or scientific perspective. Instead, they turned to their folklore, their beliefs in the supernatural, to make sense of what was happening. They had no other choice. But in doing so, they may have been overlooking a far more rational explanation. Or perhaps, there was something deeply unnatural at work that even the keenest scientific mind of the time could not comprehend. Imagine, for a moment, what life must have been like for the villagers. The constant shadow of death looming over them, always at a young age, and always under mysterious circumstances. There were no elders to guide the community, no one to show the younger generations how to live through the inevitability of old age. In the midst of a harsh and unforgiving landscape, life was fragile enough, but in a place where death was anything but natural, it must have been impossible to find peace. The village, despite its beauty and charm, was anything but a sanctuary. It was a ticking time bomb of despair. There were rumors, of course, tales passed down through the generations about who or what might be behind the phenomenon. Some suggested that the village was cursed, a place doomed from its very foundation. Others claimed that the villagers had angered some dark force or deity, who took retribution in the form of unnatural death. These stories, though chilling, often failed to offer any concrete explanation. Instead, they created a sense of helplessness, a resignation to the fact that there was no way to escape the curse. The villagers were trapped, bound by forces they could not see or understand, unable to break free from the death that stalked them. And then, there were those who sought to explain it differently, more rationally. Perhaps, they thought, there was a disease, some kind of epidemic, that was running rampant through the village, one that had gone unnoticed by the authorities. After all, diseases and illnesses had plagued villages throughout history, but it would have been almost impossible for one illness to manifest itself across multiple generations in such a way. It was too consistent, too targeted. There was something deliberate about the way it played out. Still, as much as the villagers clung to their superstitions and folklore, modern historians and medical experts have tried, over the years, to piece together what happened. Their work has uncovered more than just a series of strange deaths. It has uncovered a deep mystery that continues to haunt the historical landscape. The village's dark demographic records have now become the stuff of legend, studied by researchers and historians trying to make sense of what happened during those dark years. It's easy to dismiss the mystery as some bizarre accident or coincidence, but the more we look at the evidence, the more it suggests that something, or someone, was manipulating the very fabric of life and death in this village. The question then becomes not just why no one died of natural causes, but how such a phenomenon could even be possible. Was it an environmental factor? A series of misdiagnoses? Or was there something far darker, something hidden from view, that shaped the fate of these villages? The answer is not so simple, and as we continue to explore the available records and theories, we begin to realize that the truth of the village is likely far more complex than anyone has been able to comprehend. But the chilling reality is that no one will ever know for sure what happened. The records may be incomplete, the stories may be lost to time, and the village itself may no longer exist. Yet, the eerie enigma it left behind persists, buried in the dusty pages of forgotten history. What could it have been? Poisoning? A virus? A curse? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear: the village where no one died of natural causes will forever remain one of Transylvania's darkest, most perplexing mysteries, a place where the very concept of death was shattered, and the line between life and death became disturbingly blurred. Transylvania, a name that resonates with the eerie and the unknown, has long been shrouded in an atmosphere of mystery. For centuries, this region of Romania has been a land where folklore and reality intertwine, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is often indistinguishable. With its dense forests, towering mountains, and isolated villages, Transylvania has always seemed like a place where strange occurrences could easily go unnoticed or, conversely, where the fantastical could easily take root. Yet, while the region is most famously associated with the legend of Count Dracula, it is also a place that has witnessed numerous historical events of profound significance, some more unsettling than others. Transylvania's historical backdrop is as complex as the land itself. From the time of the Roman Empire, which once claimed the region as part of its eastern provinces, to its later incorporation into the Kingdom of Hungary, Transylvania has always been a crossroads for various cultures, peoples, and ideologies. The region's population has been a mosaic of ethnic groups: Hungarians, Saxons, Romanians, and other minorities, each bringing their own traditions, languages, and beliefs. This cultural diversity made Transylvania a melting pot, but it also bred tension and conflict, tensions that would shape much of its history and, in turn, the beliefs and superstitions that still persist today. During the 18th century, the political landscape of Transylvania was defined by its precarious position within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a time of profound social change, as the old feudal structures were beginning to erode, and the Enlightenment was starting to influence the intellectual circles of the region. Yet, even as the world around them was changing, many in the rural areas of Transylvania held fast to older traditions and beliefs that were steeped in the supernatural, in ancient myths, and in the idea that the world was governed not just by natural laws, but by forces that were beyond human comprehension. In the isolated villages of Transylvania, these beliefs were particularly strong. The villagers lived in a world that was far removed from the advances of modern science and medicine. Most had little to no formal education, and their understanding of the world was shaped largely by folklore passed down through generations. They believed in witches, vampires, ghosts, and other dark entities that, they thought, could influence the living. The supernatural wasn't something that could be easily dismissed. It was a living, breathing part of their reality. And in a place where fear of the unknown ran deep, every death, particularly one that seemed unnatural, could easily be attributed to something malevolent. At the same time, Transylvania was a region plagued by its own unique challenges. The land itself was often harsh, with difficult terrain and a climate that could be unforgiving, especially during the long, bitter winters. The people living in these villages had to contend with poverty, famine, and disease, often in isolation from the outside world. In these conditions, it was easy to see how death could become an enigma. With limited access to medical care and an understanding of disease rooted in superstition rather than science, the villagers might have seen every death, particularly one that seemed sudden or unexplained, as the result of dark forces beyond their control. It was in this cultural and historical context that the village in question existed. While the rest of the world was moving forward, this particular village was steeped in the old ways, bound by ancient traditions and superstitions. The death of a villager, in such an isolated and insular community, could easily be perceived as a harbinger of something darker. It was not just the death itself that mattered, but the manner of the death, the timing, and whether it was a part of some greater, more terrifying pattern. The arrival of the 18th century in Transylvania did not mark a time of great progress for the village. In fact, many would argue that the period was one of stagnation. The village was small, isolated, and entrenched in its way of life. The people here were farmers, herders, and craftsmen, simple folk who had little interest in the grand political movements of the time. They were more concerned with surviving the seasons, dealing with the elements, and keeping their family safe. But as the years wore on, something began to change. It began subtly, with whispers at the marketplace and in the streets. People started to notice that something was amiss. The deaths, while not entirely uncommon in any community, seemed different here. There were no natural deaths, at least, none that could be explained by the usual causes. As the years passed, the mystery deepened. The local priest, a man steeped in both faith and the old superstitions, became increasingly uneasy as he buried the dead. He spoke of a curse, of dark forces that had taken root in the village. And as the death toll rose, his voice became one of many, joining the chorus of the frightened and the fearful. The people began to believe that something unnatural was happening, that their lives were being snuffed out by forces beyond their understanding. But this wasn't just a matter of superstition. The villagers were pragmatic people, and they sought explanations where they could find them. While many turned to religious figures for answers, others looked to local healers, midwives, and wise women who had long been the unofficial doctors of the village. These women, who often practiced their own brand of herbal medicine, were sometimes seen as suspicious figures, especially in a time and place where anything outside the realm of traditional knowledge was viewed with suspicion. Some villagers believed that the strange deaths might be the result of poison, perhaps put into the water supply or administered by someone with malicious intent. But why, then, had there been so many of them? Why no natural causes? As the mystery deepened, some villagers began to connect the dots. Could the deaths be the result of an epidemic, something that the medical practitioners of the time were unable to detect? Perhaps a disease had spread through the community, one that was too subtle to notice, but deadly nonetheless. But the deaths were not isolated to one group or one age range. They spanned generations, affecting children, adults, and the elderly alike. If it had been a disease, how could it have targeted the entire population without exception? It was a question that gnawed at the villagers, and one that, ultimately, could never be answered in their time. As the years wore on, the village became a place of dread. People avoided it, and outsiders feared to enter. The mystery of the deaths loomed large, overshadowing the once vibrant community. It was as if the land itself had become cursed. And while the reasons behind the strange phenomenon may never be fully understood, the story of this village, and its dark demographic records, remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Transylvanian history. The village, isolated as it was, may have been a microcosm of Transylvania itself, a land caught between the ancient world and the modern. A place where myth and reality collided, and where death, in its most unnatural form, seemed to haunt the land like a spectre. The truth, as it often is with such mysteries, may never be fully known. But the story of this village, of the deaths that defied all logic, remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of this enigmatic region. The village, a small, isolated community in the heart of Transylvania, was a place untouched by the rapid changes of the outside world. Its cobblestone streets wound through the village centre, flanked by modest homes made of wood and stone, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of countless winters. Around it, dense forests and towering peaks of the Carpathian Mountains stood as silent sentinels, isolating the villagers from the more modern influences of society. The world beyond the village felt like another realm entirely, one of progress, enlightenment, and sophistication. But here, in this village, time moved slowly, and life was simple, if not harsh. It was a place where the cycle of life and death seemed as predictable as the changing seasons. The villagers, most of them farmers and herders, lived off the land, relying on the bounty of their crops and livestock to survive. They had learned to read the rhythms of nature, the signs of a coming storm, the way the soil smelled after the first rain, the way the birds acted when the seasons shifted. Theirs was a life defined by hard work, tight-knit community bonds, and an unwavering belief in the power of tradition. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence lay a dark undercurrent, a quiet dread that began to take hold as something unnatural gripped the village. At the heart of the village was its church, a modest stone structure with a steeple that seemed to reach toward the heavens. The church was the center of the community, not just spiritually but socially. It was where the villagers gathered to worship, to pray for good harvests, and to bury their dead. The local priest, a man who had seen the community through both good times and bad, was an important figure in the village. His role was not just to provide spiritual guidance, but to offer comfort in times of loss. In a place so steeped in superstition and faith, he was more than just a religious leader. He was a beacon of hope, a man who could offer solace to the grieving and answers to the fearful. But over time, even the priest began to notice something unsettling. The deaths, while not unusual in a village of this size, were beginning to feel different. There was no longer a clear pattern. In some villages, disease could strike suddenly, wiping out whole families, but the deaths here were not following any logical progression. They weren't tied to age or gender, and they didn't seem to stem from any particular illness. Young and old alike, men and women, all died under mysterious circumstances. Some died in their sleep, others after a brief illness that seemed to strike quickly and without warning. The timing was strange too. Death seemed to occur in clusters, with several villagers dying within a short span of one another. The local healer, a woman who had lived in the village her entire life, was among the first to notice the disturbing trend. Known for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, she had helped countless villagers over the years with ailments both minor and serious. But even she couldn't make sense of what was happening. Her remedies had failed to prevent death. The sicknesses, if they could even be called that, seemed to resist all treatment, and no one could explain why. There was a strange reluctance among the villagers to speak openly about their fears. Perhaps it was superstition that held them back, the belief that speaking of death too openly would only invite more of it. But whatever the cause, the growing sense of unease was palpable. At first, the villagers shrugged it off, chalking the deaths up to bad luck, or perhaps a particularly harsh winter that had weakened the immune systems of the population. After all, death was not unusual in a place like this, where life was often short and the elements unforgiving. But as the pattern continued, each death not tied to age or illness, each one mysterious in its suddenness, a sense of foreboding began to take hold. Whispers started to circulate that something was wrong, that something darker than illness was at play. The elders of the village, those few who were old enough to remember life before the strange deaths began, told tales of a time when the village had been free of such tragedy. They spoke of a time when the villagers were healthy and the harvests plentiful. But those times seemed long past, and the elders were quick to attribute the change to a curse. Perhaps, they said, the village had angered some dark force, an ancient spirit of the land, or even the devil himself. The more they spoke, the more the villagers began to believe it. The idea of a curse, while unsettling, was something familiar to them. It was a concept they could understand, a force they could imagine having the power to shape their fates. And so, fear began to fester. The priest, who had initially tried to calm the villagers with words of faith, now found himself growing uneasy. His prayers, though earnest, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The deaths were not stopping, and his sermons began to take on a darker tone. No longer was he speaking of hope and redemption. Now, his words were filled with warnings. He told the villagers to repent, to pray harder, to be vigilant against the evil that had crept into their midst. But still, the deaths continued. The villagers, torn between their faith and their fear, were left in a state of confusion. They didn't know what to believe. Was this really a curse, or was there something else at work? The villagers' sense of community began to fracture under the weight of the growing mystery. People who had once been neighbors, friends, and family members now found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering who would be next. The isolation that had once been a comfort now seemed like a prison. It was as if the very air around them had changed, thick with fear and uncertainty. Rumors began to spread that the village was being targeted, that someone, or something, was deliberately causing the deaths. Some villagers even speculated that there was a murderer among them, someone who was poisoning the water supply or secretly administering fatal doses of some unknown substance. But who could it be? And why? No one had any answers, and with each passing day, the uncertainty grew. But there was something even more unnerving than the deaths themselves. It was the way that the villagers reacted, or, rather, the way they stopped reacting. As more and more people died, it became clear that this village had become numb to the very concept of death. The funerals were no longer a time of communal mourning but rather an expected ritual, a process that had to be carried out in silence and without fanfare. The dead were buried quickly, and life, however disjointed, moved on. There was no sense of disbelief, no sense of horror, just an acceptance, as if the villagers had come to understand that death was no longer something to be feared, but simply something that was part of the fabric of their existence. This acceptance, however, was not the same as peace. It was a hollow acceptance, born not of understanding, but of terror. The villagers had become resigned to their fate, believing that whatever force was causing these deaths was something they could neither understand nor stop. And so, they carried on, as best as they could, trapped in a cycle of fear, unable to escape the chilling grip that seemed to be tightening around their lives. It is within this context, this dark, fearful, and almost resigned existence, that the villagers' mysterious demographic records take on even greater significance. For here, in this small corner of Transylvania, death had become something that could not be explained by natural causes. And yet, no one questioned it. No one sought to understand it beyond the realm of superstition. The village had become a place where life and death were intertwined in a way that defied logic, and where the shadow of fear loomed larger than any possibility of escape. The village's demographic records were, in many ways, the key to understanding the dark mystery that had plagued the community for so many years. They were a puzzle, one that, when pieced together, painted a haunting and bizarre picture of life and death in this remote corner of Transylvania. These records, which had once been seen as mundane documents cataloguing the lives of villagers, had taken on a new, unsettling significance. For in them, there was a stark and undeniable truth. There was no record of anyone dying from natural causes. At first glance, this anomaly might seem like a mere statistical curiosity, an odd quirk of fate, but as researchers began to examine the records more closely, they found something far darker hidden within the numbers. In a region like Transylvania, where disease, famine, and harsh winters were part of everyday life, death was something that was expected, even inevitable. And yet, in this particular village, the record suggested something completely different. People died, yes, but always under mysterious circumstances. Deaths that were marked as the result of accidents, violence, or disease, but never as the result of old age, natural illness, or the usual causes of death that one might expect. This anomaly was first noted by outsiders who had come to study the village's population. They were historians, anthropologists, and even government officials sent to assess the state of the community. When they reviewed the death records, they were struck by the oddity of the data. The pattern was glaring. Year after year, the deaths seemed to fall into a predictable, but deeply unsettling, pattern. There was no natural death. Every recorded death was the result of something other than the expected progression of life. Even the elderly, those whose deaths would normally be attributed to age or related conditions, had passed away under strange circumstances. Some researchers initially believed that there must have been a mistake in the records. Perhaps, they thought, the villagers had simply failed to document the natural deaths properly. But as they dug deeper into the history of the village, it became clear that the absence of natural deaths was not an oversight, but a deliberate and persistent trend. The village's demographic records didn't just lack natural deaths, they seemed to actively defy the laws of nature itself. The more one looked at the details, the more the pattern became impossible to ignore. The first thing that stood out was the rate at which people died. While other villages in the region had similar mortality rates due to common causes like old age, infectious disease, and harsh living conditions, this village's death rate was far higher. But it wasn't the rate that was so shocking, it was the causes. The causes of death ranged from accidents like falls, drownings, and fires, to what could only be described as violent deaths. There were deaths from animal attacks, unexplained injuries, and even what appeared to be random acts of violence, though no one could explain why. In many cases, the deaths seemed to occur in clusters. It wasn't uncommon for several people to die within a short period of time, sometimes a few weeks, other times a few months. These clusters of death were particularly mysterious because they didn't follow any discernible pattern. They weren't tied to seasonal illness, nor were they related to famine or epidemic. In some cases, entire families were wiped out in a matter of weeks. What was particularly unsettling about these deaths was that they were often so sudden and so violent. It was as if a hidden hand was manipulating the lives of the villagers, picking them off one by one. One of the most chilling aspects of the demographic records was the total absence of elderly individuals. Normally, in any given population, a certain percentage of deaths would be attributed to old age. But in this village, the elderly seemed to vanish. Those who lived to advanced years, it seemed, would die unexpectedly, often under mysterious circumstances, never having the opportunity to quietly pass away in their sleep. It was as if death itself had made a deliberate choice not to allow natural aging to run its course. Theories about the causes of death began to emerge, and while some villagers speculated that the deaths might have been the result of a curse or supernatural forces, Others looked for more grounded explanations. One of the most commonly proposed ideas was that there was an epidemic of some sort, perhaps a disease that had spread through the village, but one that was too subtle or slow to be detected by the medical practices of the time. However, this theory didn't account for the consistent absence of natural deaths. After all, if an epidemic were at play, it would have left its mark on the population more visibly, but the records indicated that, while many died under mysterious circumstances, there were no signs of a widespread illness. Another possibility that emerged was the theory of poisoning. Perhaps, some speculated, the village was being poisoned over time. This could explain the sudden, unexpected deaths, especially in cases where multiple members of a family had died within a short time frame. The idea that a slow-acting poison, perhaps something like arsenic, was being introduced into the water supply or food, became a popular theory among those who were trying to make sense of the deaths. But even this theory posed a problem. If poison were the cause, it would not explain the variety of ways in which people died, drownings, accidents, and violent acts that had no clear connection to poisoning. Perhaps the most chilling possibility was the idea that someone in the village was deliberately causing these deaths, and that this unknown figure, or group, was somehow manipulating the demographic records to cover their tracks. This theory would explain the violence and randomness of the deaths, as well as the apparent targeting of certain individuals. But who could this person or group be? And why would they be targeting their own neighbors, their own families? As the mystery deepened, more and more questions arose. Was it possible that the village had been unknowingly trapped in a cycle of death and destruction, one that was too deeply ingrained to escape? Were the villagers themselves complicit in their own demise, either through ignorance or through some deeper, hidden knowledge? The demographic records seemed to offer no answers, only more questions. The more the records were analyzed, the more it became clear that this village was not just facing an anomaly in its death rates. It was facing a reality in which death itself had been redefined, twisted, and manipulated beyond recognition. The eerie lack of natural death in the village had become not just a statistical anomaly, but a haunting testament to the deeper forces at play. Whatever the cause of the deaths, one thing was certain: something was wrong in this village. The demographic records, once innocuous and dry, had become a chilling narrative of lives cut short, a catalogue of mysteries that could never be fully understood. And as the village continued to grapple with its terrifying reality, it became clear that the true explanation behind the deaths would remain elusive, hidden in the gaps between the lines of history, where dark forces may have been quietly at work, shaping the lives and deaths of an entire community. As the death toll continued to rise in the village, rumors began to spread. The deaths were too numerous, too strange, and too widespread to be dismissed as coincidence or mere misfortune. Though the villagers had long been accustomed to hardship and loss, the sheer frequency and unpredictability of these deaths created a sense of mounting dread. It wasn't just that people were dying, it was that they were dying in unnatural ways. There were no natural explanations to account for the tragic and mysterious events unfolding in the village. Theories began to emerge, some grounded in reality, others veering into the realm of superstition and the supernatural. One of the most persistent and unsettling theories was that the village was being ravaged by an epidemic, an illness so elusive, so insidious, that it left no traces and could not be detected by the medical knowledge of the time. The possibility of an epidemic, especially one that had somehow gone undetected by local healers and physicians, seemed plausible to many in the village. After all, infectious diseases had been a constant threat in the pre-modern world, and entire communities had been wiped out by plagues, fevers, and other viral or bacterial illnesses. But what made this theory so terrifying was the strange and varied nature of the deaths. There was no single pattern. The victims came from all walks of life: men, women, young, old. None were exempt. Some died suddenly after seemingly healthy periods, others after short bouts of illness that left no lasting symptoms. There were no signs of a common disease, no recognizable symptoms like fever, cough, or fatigue that would indicate a viral infection. The villagers were dying in different ways, some by drowning, others by falling from great heights, still others were burned alive in mysterious fires, and some were found with fatal injuries, as though attacked. Local healers, who had long been trusted with the health of the community, were at a loss. The herbal remedies they prescribed had always worked in the past, but this time, nothing seemed to work. They couldn't identify the source of the illness, or illnesses, for they couldn't even agree on whether it was one disease or a number of different ones wreaking havoc on the village. Perhaps the villagers had contracted a rare, undiagnosed disease that no one could see or understand. But that didn't explain the violence of the deaths. A disease could weaken a person, make them ill for days or weeks before ultimately taking their life, but these deaths were often swift, violent, and brutal. This didn't feel like a disease at all. It felt like something else entirely. The more the villagers tried to make sense of it, the more unsettling the situation became. The theory of an epidemic was plausible, but the deaths were too varied to follow a simple pattern of contagion. It was as if the deaths were carefully distributed, each one a distinct event. The village, isolated as it was, had a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else. And yet, the deaths seemed random, unpredictable, and without a clear explanation. It was as if a malevolent force, something or someone, was picking off the villagers one by one, as though guided by some unseen hand. Some began to whisper that it was not an epidemic at all, but something far darker at play. Could it have been poisoning? The idea began to gain traction in the village, especially after certain families had experienced a series of tragic deaths within a short period of time. The thought of poisoning, a slow and subtle form of death, seemed to fit with the mysterious nature of the fatalities. Poison could explain the suddenness of the deaths, as well as the randomness. But poisoning also brought with it other questions. Who could be poisoning the villagers, and why? What could possibly motivate someone to slowly and deliberately kill their own neighbors, their own friends and family? And more importantly, what poison could possibly be so powerful, so effective, and so undetectable that it could cause death without leaving a trace? The villagers turned their attention to their food and water supply. Could someone be tainting the well water? Or perhaps the grain stores that had been harvested earlier that year had been compromised. But there were no clear answers. In a small, insular village like this, it would have been difficult for a murderer to go unnoticed. The people lived closely together, and everyone knew who was buying what, who was preparing the meals, who was tending to the cattle. It seemed unlikely that anyone would be able to slip a poison unnoticed into the villagers' daily food. And yet, the deaths were too numerous and varied to be explained away by simple accidents or disease. The villagers were grasping at straws. As the idea of poisoning continued to circulate, the possibility that there was a deliberate, orchestrated attempt to kill off the villagers began to take root. Perhaps there was a murderer, or a group of murderers, targeting specific individuals, or perhaps trying to wipe out the entire village. But why would anyone want to do such a thing? Was it some kind of vendetta? A feud that had escalated into violence? Or was there something even more sinister at play? Some began to suggest that the deaths were part of a larger conspiracy, a plot to destabilize the village, or perhaps even the region. These suggestions, while disturbing, found an audience among those who were desperate for an explanation, any explanation, that could make sense of the horror that had befallen them. One of the most troubling aspects of this theory was the randomness of the deaths. If there were indeed a murderer or group of murderers in the village, they were selective in their targets, yet at the same time, their actions seemed chaotic. The deaths weren't confined to any one group or family, but instead spanned the entire village. The violence wasn't confined to any particular demographic. Old, young, men, women, no one seemed exempt from the terror. If it were a plot to murder the villagers, it seemed poorly executed, random, and indiscriminate. A professional assassin, or even a group of conspirators, would surely have targeted specific people, perhaps those who held power or wealth within the community. But these deaths were far more indiscriminate. The villagers' desperation for answers continued to deepen, and as the deaths escalated, the possibility of a supernatural explanation began to gain momentum. As much as the villagers tried to reason through the situation, there was always that lingering fear, the fear that something darker was at work. Could it be a curse? Could the village be haunted by some ancient, malevolent force? The very thought was enough to send chills down the spine of anyone who dared entertain it. In a place where folklore ran deep, where the ancient beliefs in spirits, witches, and the undead held sway, it wasn't a stretch to imagine that the village could have fallen victim to some curse, perhaps from an unknown enemy or a long-forgotten wrong. As the villagers continued to grapple with the mounting deaths, their fear began to morph into something more insidious: resignation. The atmosphere of the village grew tense, as the community's collective will to survive began to falter. Where once they had clung to the hope that an epidemic could be contained, or that a murderer could be caught, they now found themselves at the mercy of something they couldn't understand. The village, once a close-knit community, began to disintegrate into a state of paranoia. Friend turned against friend, neighbor against neighbor. The uncertainty of death hanging over them all created an unspoken tension, a kind of silent dread that no one dared acknowledge out loud. In the end, despite all the theories and speculations, the cause of the deaths remained elusive. Was it a hidden epidemic that had never been identified? Or was there a more sinister force at play, something far darker than anyone had dared to imagine? Whatever the cause, one thing was clear: the deaths had struck at the very heart of the village, leaving behind a trail of fear, grief, and unanswered questions. And as the village's tragic story continued to unfold, it became apparent that the true nature of the deaths would never be fully understood. What began as a series of unexplained fatalities would eventually be remembered as one of the darkest mysteries in Transylvanian history, a tale of death that refused to follow the natural order, and a community left to wrestle with the horrors of the unknown. As the years passed and the deaths continued without any logical explanation, the villagers began to lose hope that they would ever uncover the truth behind the mysterious phenomenon. Theories about epidemics, curses, and poisoning all failed to provide any real answers, leaving the community trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. But in the midst of this growing despair, an outsider, someone from beyond the village, arrived with a fresh perspective. This outsider, a scholar from a nearby city, had heard of the strange occurrences in the village and was determined to investigate. Unlike the villagers, who had become resigned to their fate, this outsider came with a scientific mind, looking to uncover the cause behind the tragedy, not simply explain it away with superstition or folklore. The scholar's name was Dr. Andrei Pavel, a historian with a keen interest in the mysteries of the human body and the ancient medical practices of the region. His work had previously focused on investigating unexplained deaths in rural areas, particularly those tied to cultural practices, local beliefs, and what could be described as social contagion, the phenomenon by which fear and superstition can contribute to the spread of illness or even death. When he first arrived in the village, he was met with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity from the residents. Many of them were wary of outsiders, especially after years of dealing with an inexplicable tragedy. But Dr. Pavel's calm demeanor and respectful approach to their beliefs gradually won them over, and soon he was able to begin his investigation. At first, Dr. Pavel's focus was on the village's historical records, especially the death registers. As he examined the documents, he saw what others had seen before: an eerie pattern that defied the laws of nature. The suddenness and unpredictability of the deaths were enough to suggest that there was something more than simple disease or natural causes at work. However, it wasn't just the nature of the deaths that caught his attention. It was the demographic trends, the way in which entire families had been wiped out over short periods of time. Dr. Pavel was struck by the strange recurrence of these clusters of deaths, as if the village had been visited by some invisible hand that was carefully selecting its victims. But he knew that superstition alone could not provide answers. He needed to dig deeper into the physical evidence, into the very bodies of the dead. Dr. Pavel's first challenge was gaining permission to exhume the bodies of those who had died under suspicious circumstances. The villagers, while somewhat open to his investigation, were still deeply reluctant to disturb the graves of their loved ones. In their eyes, the dead had already suffered enough, and to disturb their resting places seemed disrespectful, especially in a community where death was already viewed with such suspicion. After much pleading and several weeks of negotiation, Dr. Pavel finally convinced the villagers that it was the only way to truly understand what was happening. He assured them that the bodies would be treated with the utmost respect and that no harm would come to them. Reluctantly, the village elders gave their approval, and the exhumations began. What Dr. Pavel discovered during the exhumation process was both shocking and perplexing. He had expected to find signs of disease, perhaps evidence of poisoning, or even traces of a rare form of trauma that could explain the strange deaths. But what he found instead were bodies that seemed almost untouched by the passage of time. Many of the corpses appeared unnaturally well preserved, as though they had been embalmed, despite the fact that no formal embalming had taken place. The skin was tight and smooth, and in some cases, the corpses even appeared to have retained some semblance of color, which was highly unusual for bodies that had been buried for years. At first, Dr. Pavel was baffled. He had never seen anything like it in all his years of studying rural communities and ancient burial practices. As he continued to examine the bodies, he noticed something even more unsettling. There were no signs of decomposition, no bloating or signs of decay that were typical for bodies that had been buried for an extended period of time. Some of the corpses even appeared to have been in a state of suspended animation, as though they had not truly died at all. In one particularly strange case, the body of a young woman who had died several years earlier showed no signs of the typical decay that would have occurred after such a long period underground. Her face remained perfectly intact, with no signs of decomposition, and her limbs were stiff, as if she had been frozen in time. It was almost as though she had been placed in a state of artificial preservation, yet there were no signs of any such process having taken place. What was even more perplexing was that there were no visible wounds or injuries on the bodies, despite the fact that many of the deaths had been violent in nature. If the deaths had been the result of some form of trauma, such as a fall, a fire, or an animal attack, there should have been visible evidence on the bodies. But there was nothing. It was as if the people had died not from injury, but from something that was far harder to understand, something that could not be seen, only felt. Dr. Pavel's mind raced as he tried to piece together the clues. What was the cause of death? And why were these bodies so remarkably well preserved? Was there something in the soil, in the air, or in the water that could explain the phenomenon? Could a rare form of preservation be taking place, perhaps due to unique environmental conditions? Or was it possible that some other factor, something outside of nature, was at play? After weeks of studying the bodies and conducting various tests, Dr. Pavel came to a shocking conclusion. He believed that the deaths were not the result of disease, violence, or natural causes, but something far stranger, a form of mass hysteria or psychosomatic illness that had been triggered by fear and superstition. He theorized that the villagers, living in such isolation and steeped in ancient beliefs about curses and the supernatural, had experienced a kind of collective psychological breakdown. The fear of death, combined with the growing belief that some dark force was taking hold of the village, had led to a phenomenon known as mass sociogenic illness or mass hysteria. In this state, the power of collective belief had become so strong that it had manifested physically, affecting not only the minds of the villagers but their bodies as well. The victims, Dr. Pavel hypothesized, may not have actually died in the traditional sense. Instead, they had entered into a state of psychological paralysis, where their bodies appeared to be lifeless, their vital signs disappeared, and they were mistakenly thought to be dead. In some cases, this could have been further exacerbated by the lack of proper medical knowledge at the time, with villagers and even medical practitioners mistakenly identifying the symptoms of this psychological state as death. While this theory explained some of the strange aspects of the deaths, it did not account for everything. Dr. Pavel was still puzzled by the body's unnaturally well-preserved state. Could it be that the fear itself had triggered some biological process that slowed down decomposition? Or was there another explanation entirely, one that could only be understood in the context of the villagers' deeply ingrained superstitions and fears? The scholar's work brought new light to the mystery of the village, but it also left many unanswered questions. The villagers, though grateful for Dr. Pavel's efforts, were not entirely convinced by his theories. The power of their ancient beliefs was too strong, too deeply rooted to be easily dismissed. For them, the deaths were still a manifestation of something far darker, something beyond the reach of science and reason. And so, the mystery of the village where no one died of natural causes remained unsolved, its haunting legacy continuing to linger in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains. The arrival of Dr. Pavel had not only brought a renewed sense of investigation but also a stirring of deeper emotions among the villagers. Despite his thorough research and detailed scientific theories, the villagers remained tethered to their belief that something more sinister was at work. Dr. Pavel's findings, while compelling to an outsider, could not erase the centuries-old traditions, folklore, and superstitions that had been passed down through generations. For the villagers, their world was defined not just by what could be seen and touched, but by what could not be explained, those mysteries that had been woven into the fabric of their daily lives. No matter how much evidence Dr. Pavel presented to rationalize the deaths, it couldn't fully dispel the haunting belief that their community was cursed, that some invisible evil had taken root in their midst. In the months following Dr. Pavel's investigation, the village had become divided. Some residents, especially the younger ones, had begun to entertain the idea that there might be a logical explanation to the deaths, and they had started to view Dr. Pavel's theories with cautious optimism. Others, particularly the elders, had become more entrenched in their belief that the village was under a curse, a malediction that had been placed upon them for some long-forgotten wrong. These elders spoke often of the old stories, of spirits and demons that roamed the Carpathian Mountains, of witches who cursed the land, and of ancient rituals that had been forgotten by time but still clung to the land like a shadow. For them, the scientific explanation was simply too foreign, too rational to explain what they had seen with their own eyes. They held to the ancient belief that death, in all its forms, was a force that could not be understood by human logic. Despite the growing rift in the village, one thing was certain: the deaths had left an indelible mark on the community. The villagers' once tight-knit bonds had been frayed by fear and suspicion. Neighbors who had once shared meals and stories now avoided each other. The cemetery, once a peaceful place of rest, had become an eerie sight, with fresh graves springing up with frightening regularity. The very act of burying the dead had taken on a ritualistic quality, with ceremonies growing more somber, and the air thick with unspoken tension. The act of mourning itself had become a burden, a reminder that something was not right, and that the cycle of death was far from over. It was during this time of division that rumors began to swirl once again. While Dr. Pavel had made his scientific theories known, the old fears had not been easily silenced. The rumors, which had once been whispers at the village square, now began to take on a more alarming tone. Some claimed that strange occurrences were happening at night, lights were seen flickering in the woods, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. The dogs had begun to bark at nothing, and some of the villagers reported hearing whispers in the wind, whispers that seemed to call their names. These signs were seen by some as proof that the village was still haunted by dark forces, and that the deaths were the result of some powerful, malevolent spirit. The villagers, especially the elderly, spoke of a figure from the past, a man who had once lived among them but had vanished without a trace many years ago. He was known as Mikhail, a reclusive figure who had lived on the outskirts of the village. Some said he had been a healer, while others whispered that he had been a sorcerer, someone who had practiced forbidden arts. His disappearance had never been fully explained, and the villagers had long speculated that he had either fled in fear of the law or had been taken by the very forces he had tried to control. Some claimed that it was his curse that had brought the deaths upon the village, and that his spirit, trapped in the woods, was still seeking vengeance. As the rumors gained traction, the younger generation, who had once sought to dismiss the old superstitions, found themselves drawn back into the web of fear. They had seen the bodies, the preserved corpses that seemed impervious to time, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond human comprehension was at play. They too began to whisper that the village had been cursed, and that whatever force was causing the deaths could not be reasoned with, could not be understood. Perhaps, they speculated, the curse had been placed on the village long ago, and only the rituals of the past could break it. But what were those rituals? How could they be performed? And who was left to perform them? This growing sense of helplessness brought the villagers back to the figure of Mikhail. His name had once been spoken in fear, but now it took on a more potent meaning. The idea that he might have been the source of the villagers' troubles gained new life. A small group of villagers, desperate for answers, decided to venture into the woods where Mikhail had once lived. Armed with only candles and a fragile sense of courage, they ventured into the dense forest, seeking the remnants of his home. The forest, thick and ancient, seemed to hold its secrets, and the further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the group. As they walked deeper into the woods, they found the ruins of Mikhail's home, now little more than a broken stone foundation overtaken by creeping vines and moss. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, as though the forest itself had swallowed it whole. Among the ruins, they found something strange, something that would haunt them forever. Beneath the rubble of what was once a home, they uncovered a small chest, its wood warped and rotted with age. When they opened it, they found ancient scrolls, brittle with time. The villagers, trembling, unrolled one of the scrolls and found that it contained strange symbols, symbols that none of them recognized, but that seemed to pulse with an energy they could not explain. The scrolls also contained references to rituals, some dark and others cryptic, written in a language that the villagers could not decipher. But there was one phrase that caught their attention: "The keeper of souls, bound to the land, will take what was never given." It was a chilling phrase, and though they couldn't understand the full meaning, it sent shivers down their spines. The villagers, now more afraid than ever, took the scrolls back to the village, hoping that someone would be able to make sense of them. But as the villagers pored over the scrolls, they found that the words seemed to pull them further into the mystery. It was as if the very act of reading the scrolls was pulling them deeper into a web they couldn't escape. One by one, they began to fall ill, succumbing to the same mysterious ailments that had claimed so many others. Their eyes grew vacant, their movements sluggish, as though they too were falling under the influence of whatever Mikhail had unleashed. The once hopeful search for answers had turned into a nightmare. The more the villagers tried to piece together the mystery, the more they realized that they were part of something far older and far darker than they had ever imagined. The curse, it seemed, was not just a product of the past, it was a force that had taken root in the very soil of the land, a force that had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. The death toll continued to rise, and the village, once a thriving community, began to dwindle. The elder villagers, those who still clung to the old ways, began to fear that the village would soon be abandoned entirely. But before that could happen, something even stranger occurred. A new arrival, a stranger from another village, appeared in the community, claiming to be a descendant of Mikhail himself. This man, named Radu, was different from the others. He spoke with authority, as if he knew more about the curse and the rituals than anyone else. He claimed that the curse could be lifted, but only through a final ritual, one that required the sacrifice of the last living heir of Mikhail. As the village teetered on the edge of destruction, the question remained: would the villagers go along with Radu's plan, or would they find a way to break free from the curse that had haunted them for so long? Time was running out, and the villagers had little choice but to confront the dark legacy that had been set in motion centuries before. The arrival of Radu, Mikhail's alleged descendant, was met with a mixture of fear, skepticism, and a glimmer of hope. For some of the villagers, his appearance was nothing short of a sign, perhaps the very solution they had been waiting for. For others, particularly the older generation, his arrival only deepened their sense of dread. The idea that Mikhail's bloodline had continued to exist, that the curse could somehow be linked to his descendants, was too much to bear. They saw Radu as a harbinger of the dark past returning, a symbol that the evil of long ago had not been vanquished but had only waited for the right moment to return. Despite the wariness that surrounded him, Radu's words were compelling. He claimed to know the rituals needed to lift the curse that had gripped the village for so many years. According to him, the curse had been woven into the land itself, a force tied to the very soil, the trees, and the winds of the region. He spoke of ancient rites that were passed down through his family, rites that had been kept secret for generations. According to Radu, these rituals were the key to breaking the cycle of death that had plagued the village, but there was a price. A heavy price. Only the last living descendant of Mikhail, the one who carried the bloodline of the man who had supposedly placed the curse, could perform the final ritual to undo what had been done centuries before. This revelation sent shockwaves through the village. The idea that the curse could be tied to Mikhail's bloodline was something that many had feared, but to hear it confirmed by someone who claimed to be part of that bloodline was enough to shake the very foundation of their beliefs. For years, the villagers had tried to rationalize the deaths, to explain them away through theories of disease, poisoning, or mass hysteria. But now, the supernatural explanation that they had always feared seemed to have found its voice. And Radu, with his dark lineage, appeared to be the key to unlocking this mystery, or perhaps, unleashing something far worse. As Radu began to speak more of the ritual, his words became more cryptic and unsettling. He explained that the curse had been placed upon the village not just by Mikhail, but by something older, something that existed long before the first human settlers arrived in the area. This force, he said, had been bound to the land by ancient rituals practiced by the ancestors of the Carpathian people. These rituals had been designed to appease a powerful spirit, a force that the villagers had long forgotten but that still lingered beneath the earth, waiting to reclaim what had once been offered to it. The curse, according to Radu, had been activated when Mikhail, in his desperate search for power, had broken the sacred pact that had bound the spirit to the land. The villagers listened in rapt attention, but many were still unsure of what to believe. Radu's claim seemed outrageous to some, even if they did speak to the long-held fears and beliefs that many had tried to suppress over the years. Yet, as strange as his words seemed, they were oddly persuasive. The deaths, the strange occurrences in the village, the increasing sense of dread, all of it seemed to line up with Radu's account of the curse. And now, as if the situation wasn't dire enough, he was suggesting that the curse could only be lifted by the descendant of Mikhail, performing a ritual of immense power. At the heart of this ritual, Radu explained, was a sacrifice, one that would bind the curse to the land once again and restore the balance that had been lost when Mikhail had turned away from the ancient pact. The sacrifice, however, would come at a steep cost. The person chosen to perform the ritual, Radu claimed, would have to give up their life in order to ensure that the curse was lifted. And that person, as fate would have it, was Radu himself. He explained that, as the last living descendant of Mikhail, he was the only one who could perform the ritual, but in doing so, he would seal his own fate. The news sent shockwaves through the village. Radu's claim to be the last living descendant of Mikhail was met with a mixture of disbelief and acceptance. Some villagers began to speculate that he had come to the village not out of some sense of duty, but because he knew that his bloodline was the key to breaking the curse. Others wondered if he had come to claim his place in the history of the village, to rewrite the legacy of his ancestor. And yet, despite the uncertainty surrounding his true intentions, There was something undeniably compelling about his presence. The villagers could not deny that Radu seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of the village's history, of the ancient practices that had been passed down through the generations, and of the forces that seemed to haunt the land. As Radu prepared for the ritual, he insisted that the villagers must participate. He told them that the ritual could only be successful if they all came together to perform it as a community. It was not just a single person's responsibility. It was a collective effort to restore balance and rid the village of the curse that had plagued them for so long. The villagers, though deeply divided in their beliefs, agreed to participate, albeit with varying degrees of enthusiasm. For some, this was the only chance to rid themselves of the terror that had haunted them for generations. For others, it was an act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to escape the torment that had defined their lives. As the day of the ritual approached, the village was filled with an uneasy anticipation. The preparations were simple but ominous. The villagers gathered in the clearing near the ancient forest, where they had always believed the spirits of the land resided. This was the place where, according to legend, Mikhail had first made his pact with the spirit that had cursed the village. It was here that the ritual would take place, and it was here that Radu would fulfill his grim destiny. As the villagers stood around the clearing, the air was thick with tension. The ritual, they were told, required the use of certain items, objects that were not to be questioned, that had been handed down through Radu's family for generations. With the moon hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land, Radu began to chant in a language that the villagers could not understand. The words were ancient, filled with power, and as they echoed through the trees, a strange stillness fell over the land. The wind stopped. The animals grew silent. The only sound was Radu's voice, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to pull at the very air around them. As he continued to chant, the villagers began to feel an odd sensation, as if the earth beneath their feet was stirring, as though the land itself was awakening to the power of the ritual. But then, something unexpected happened. As Radu reached the final words of the chant, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble.